Yes. So, welcome to European History with Dr. Brovkin, AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today's topic is the French religious wars. This is a huge topic. It spanned, the religious wars lasted for over 40 years, and then the repercussions are long lasting. It pretty much changed the history of France, and it may be even argued that religious wars in France pretty much killed the chance France had to become world power like Great Britain has become. They weakened France more than anything else. So let's go through these religious wars and see their difference from the German ones, which actually were finished, as you recall, in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg. Let's look now at the situation with France. Now, the background is that the Protestant communities were Calvinist, and they were called Huguenots. And nobody is quite sure why they were called Huguenots. There's some theory there was a church somewhere in Nîmes that was called that. There were other theories, but in any case, Huguenots is identical to Calvinists. So basically, from the time the Institutes of Christian Learning were published, 1534, you have the slow spread of Calvinist ideas in France. Partly because he wrote in French, and Geneva was French, and there was much more interaction with French-speaking communities than Luther. So these communities, amazingly, they were touching not just the merchants, which is obviously the merchants were the first people who loved Calvin's ideas, his ethics, his idea of making money, being modest, being hardworking, saving, and all the other things that go with Protestant ethics. But amazing thing also is that there were quite a lot of aristocracy, high-ranking aristocracy, even royal family was affected. In other words, there were members of royal family, and there were aristocracy all over Europe, actually even in Italy, that were taken over by the Calvinist teaching. So in the 40s and 50s, you have this spread of Calvinism in France, and the estimation is by the first Congress of the Calvinist communities, which is 1559, the estimate is that 10% of the population, and the population is quite big, it's the biggest country in Europe, it's 18 million people at that time, 10% are Calvinist. And they're centered mostly in southwest and the ports. So this would be the most important cities would be La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast, Nîmes, Montauban, and basically southwest of France. Partly because southwest of France has always been a little more rebellious, and the Midi, I mean that spirit of Midi is in opposition to Paris, has still survived to the present day. In fact, one of the major newspapers in the south, where I want to be a lot of times, is called Midi Libre, so which is again a kind of a traditional reaffirmation of rebellious independent spirit of the south. In any case, the merchant towns and aristocracy, not so much peasants. The peasants are more conservative, and they, for the moment, most of them stay Catholic. So in 59, they assemble for their first convention, and they actually organize themselves as a separate church, as a separate organization, which basically splits off from the Catholics. So at this time, you have Henry II, who is the king, and his wife, Catherine de' Medici. And so he ruled from 1547 to 59. So this is the period of Henry II, and this is the period of the spreading of Calvinist religion in France, so far peacefully. But things begin to change very, very quickly. One of the key events here is the accidental death of Henry II, her husband. He was totally accidental. He was taking part in a tournament, and they loved those medieval tournaments. So basically, one horse rider is holding a spear and is charging at full speed against the other one. And whoever kicks the first guy on the ground is a winner. A lot of times it would not end in death. It would be just knocking them down to the ground. And of course the king also loved those tournaments. But this time around, the opponent's spear just poked him right in his eye, and he died instantly. And Catherine de' Medici becomes a regent. So essentially, she now is going to rule France for another 10 years or so. She was the actual regent, the official ruler of France. And her intention at first is to maintain peace between the communities. She does not want to disband them all immediately. She basically wants to, she doesn't feel very confident, as a ruler, and she basically wants her sons to become king, and that means keep it quiet, keep it peaceful until things get better. But things begin to get out of hand. In 1560, her young son, Francois II, is kidnapped by the Huguenots, by the Calvinists. So this shows that you have a split among the aristocracy, and you have the beginning of formation for the first time in France of political parties based on religion. And moreover, the leaders of these groupings are high aristocracy. So you have Prince Conde, who is a Huguenot and who is going to be all along the leading Protestant family in France, and Duc de Guise, that they will be continuing centers of the Catholic opposition, and they will later found an organization that would be called Catholic League. In response to so the Huguenots kidnap the prince. In response, the Guise faction, or the Catholics, they attack and desecrate churches in La Rochelle, which is Protestant churches in La Rochelle, and then you have reprisals in Sens, Cahors, and Carcassonne. So you have battles. For the first time, you have clashes, attacks on churches, both Protestant and Catholic. So this is now, each time something happens, I'm going to be telling you, this is for the first time. So this is now for the first time that you have not rowdy crowds of peasants as in Germany desecrating churches, but you actually have Catholics desecrating Protestant churches, Protestants desecrating Catholic churches. You have religious communities fighting each other. So that's basically what happens. Now, in 1560 also, shortly after kidnapping, Francois II dies, and the next brother is in line. His name is Charles IX, and Catherine de' Medici continues as a regent for her next son, Charles IX. In 1561, there's État Général, with general estates in English, which is convened, which is a form of French Parliament, which is a form of convocation of representatives from the three estates in France, which is the clergy, the nobility, and the townspeople, and they basically want to discuss religious matters. And Catherine is still pursuing policy of peace, and so in 1562 they pass Edict of Toleration, which is an attempt to preserve peace for the moment and to restore some semblance of order in France. The Guise don't like it, and they incite people to massacre and to continue campaign of devastation. So again, this is the first time that you have a major leader of aristocracy who is openly campaigning against the king, in this case the queen, defiantly, and not because this is the wrong queen and there should be another one. No, because of policy, because of a religious difference. So this has never happened before, that you would have a kind of a religious accusations against the ruling queen. And now that brings us to the first war, and it depends how you count. By some counts there were 8 wars, by some counts there were 6 wars, but I'm going to go over each of those. And not so all of them began with some kind of event, and then they would be fighting, and then they would conclude peace and sign some kind of a document. And this kind of a document would always be that there will be some terms of coexistence between the Catholics and the Protestants. But I think a more important count would not be in terms of what's the name of the peace treaty they signed, but what exactly were the terms? Who was winning? The Catholics or the Protestants? On what terms did they conclude this truce, which never was really peace? It was truce, which means temporary ceasefire. So the first war is 1562 to 1568. And we have now 2 factions, or 2 political parties. One is obviously led by the Guise, and the other is one led by Prince Conde. Prince Conde is of a line which is a royal line that goes back to Louis XI, but their family name is Bourbon, and they will be actually destined to rule France until the French Revolution. So that is Bourbon. This is actually the same Bourbon who is going to be the King Henry VIII, who was a Protestant. So Prince Conde is of the Bourbon dynasty, to which Henry IV also will belong, and they are the Protestants, and they are from the southwest, and they are protectors of Calvinist Church. So what's going on in this first war? This is the war during the time when Catherine de' Medici is a ruling monarch. Now, what's new here is not just attacks on the churches and spontaneous outbursts of popular anger, but you actually have now first time private armies. Well, maybe not first. Maybe this was something that goes back to the Middle Ages, when each big, huge landowner had his own private army. Yes, you could say it goes back to the Middle Ages, where you have armies led by the dukes and nobles, but their armies not for a struggle for power or for more territory, as was the case in the Middle Ages. They are religious armies. They are religious armies, and they're not spontaneous mobs like in Germany, who are led by revolutionaries like Münzer. No, these are led by aristocrats. They're real medieval armies. You have officers, you have army. They're armed. They have detachments. They get a real army, and they do a much more thorough devastation than spontaneous angry mobs. So you have battles. 62, 63, 64, you have battles that are between these private armies, and of course Catherine is totally frustrated and she seeks peace. She still is seeking peace, and in 68 peace is signed by Edict of Toleration, which basically says that status quo as is. In other words, whatever you have now, you can have. And that means that you have certain cities, it's again the same story in the southwest, Montauban, Nîmes, La Rochelle, a few others, who are Protestant, and they are going to keep their Protestant faith. In 63, Charles IX dies. Charles IX dies, and she still continues to be the regent. And in 64 there was the truce collapsed, And in 64 there was a massacre of the Huguenots. By the Huguenots of Catholics in Nîmes. So you have an offensive that is this time broken by the Protestants. And this starts the next war. By some count, it's the second war, some counts by third war, the war of 68-70, so 2 years, from 1568 to 70. What's new in this one is that there's a pattern established. The pattern is established that once somebody wins, they don't tolerate the others in that city anymore. Basically, it's going to be either a completely Catholic city or a completely Huguenot city. There's not going to be any toleration of each other, as the case may be in England or some other places. The Catholics would not tolerate anybody in their cities, and the same goes for the Catholics. The Protestants. So the pattern is established. You have Protestant cities, and you have the rest, which is majority countryside and the cities that are Catholic. The second thing which is established is a pattern that you have fighting, and then they sign some kind of peace, and then it breaks down by another provocation somewhere or military action, and it collapses, and fighting resumes, and it goes on and on and on for another 30 years. So, you have a Huguenot army, and it's led by Conde, and he is killed in battle in 68, and he's replaced by another prince, and his name is Coligny. So the Coligny becomes the next leader, and the Huguenots lose their freedoms and they're abolished. So it seems like the Catholics are on the winning streak. The Catholic army is led by Duke d'Anjou, and in France, Duke d'Anjou is the same as Prince of Wales in England, which means the future king. So the Duke d'Anjou this time is Henry, who will be known as King Henry III. So this is her next son, and Duke d'Anjou is leaning towards the Catholics. And so he is together with the Guise, and he is leaning towards the Catholics. And for the first time, we have a new element in this war. What is new in this element in this war number 3? You have international mobilization. You have Elizabeth of England, who helps the Huguenots. You have Spain, who help the Catholics. The Germans send detachments to help the Protestants. The Dutch help the Protestants. In other words, you have basically an all-European religious war on the territory of France. And the help that comes for the first time is not based on power, money, and territory. They help ideologically. They help those who think like they do, who believe like they do. It is an ideological religious war which involves Spain and Britain and England and Germany and Netherlands and the Pope and Philip III, Philip II of Spain. Essentially, this is something that never happened before. And we should pause at this moment.